Hi, students. It's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is externalities and how they connect to the idea of market failure. So first, we have a caveat. If you remember, in class, we have claimed that markets are efficient. Economists like markets. Well, why is that? Well, when we have markets, resources flow to where they are most highly valued. So if we let the market dictate where resources go, they're going to find their way to their most valued use. So that's going to ensure that we have the right amount of things produced. So we don't have too much, we don't have too little. It's kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It's just right. So when resources flow to where they're most valued, it ensures that we have the right or socially optimal amount of things produced. And it also ensures that these are produced at the right price. They're delivered to the marketplace, to people, demanders like you and me, at the right price. So markets are efficient, they're good, resources flow in the right direction, we produce the right amount of stuff, we set the right prices. That's really what we're saying. But here's the deal. There are times when this is not true. So when I say markets are efficient, I told a little bit of a lie. I should have said markets are almost always efficient, except in a couple cases. So let's remind ourselves of our market. So we've been dealing with market equilibria, right? So you see the market below, we've got our downward sloping demand and our upward sloping supply, and the market is clearing. You see that red arrow that says equilibrium. So the equilibrium price is the right price to charge, right? It's the socially optimal price. It is where there is no surplus, no shortage, and everything is great. An equilibrium quantity is the right quantity to produce. We've not overproduced, we've not underproduced, and markets do this for us. So most of the time we would say that the market equilibrium is efficient. But we are making some assumptions when we say that previous graph at equilibrium that we have efficiency. First, we are assuming that externalities are not present. And you've already probably learned about public goods. We're assuming we're not dealing with a public good. So externalities are not present. Now, if externalities are present, and I'll tell you exactly what I mean by an externality in just a second, then markets are not efficient. Now, when I say markets are not efficient, what I'm saying is that they're still working, but they're producing too little or too much. We're also saying that the market price is not the optimal price. So let's make sure we understand what I just said. When I said markets are efficient, I was assuming away the presence of externalities, which I haven't defined for you yet, but in a second I will. If an externality is present, markets still work. Look, we still can have equilibrium. Be very clear. I'm not saying markets are broken in that they can't function. I'm not saying there's a surplus or a shortage or anything like that. I'm just saying where the market lands is not socially optimal. It's not efficient. The price it sets, not socially optimal, not efficient. The quantity it produces, not socially optimal or efficient. Now I'm going to show you some graphs to make that clear, and I understand right now this is probably a little fuzzy. I get that. So bear with me. Let's move on to talk about what we mean by an externality. And I'm going to start by a formal definition. And you need to get this definition into your notes. In the process of consumption, distribution, or production, there is a cost or a benefit that spills over to others who are innocent bystanders. Now, that is not the most formal definition I could give you, but this essentially defines what we mean by an externality. Now, these innocent bystanders are not involved in this process. So think of them as innocent bystanders where all of a sudden there's some cost imposed on them, or so there's some benefit that they receive. And they're not compensated in any way if a cost is imposed on them. So if you're an innocent bystander and this cost is imposed on you, you don't get paid anything. No one takes care of you. And there's no charge on that innocent bystander if a benefit extends to them. So they are indeed innocent bystanders where this cost or benefit is just imposed on them. And that cost or benefit comes from something having to do with consumption or distribution or production. And we'll probably have examples of probably all three of those. All right, so that's the formal definition of an externality. with some easier to understand language. But generally, that's what we mean by externality. Now, if we're talking about a cost, if we're talking about an externality that is a cost that's imposed on these innocent bystanders, we refer to that as a negative externality or an external cost. You may even see it referred to as spillover cost, but a negative externality or an external cost. But if instead we're talking about a benefit, well, that's a positive externality or an external benefit. So guys, a cost you're going to see referred to as a negative externality or external cost. If it's a benefit, positive externality or an external benefit. So be familiar with all of those terms. We have different names for basically the same thing. Now, let's use a real world example. Let's assume that you live next to a factory and that factory pollutes as it produces. Okay. Everyone agreed. This is an externality, right? Think about it. You now have unclean air and maybe there's a smell. So you're this innocent bystander, right? You don't necessarily work at the factory. You're not the boss of the factory. You're not making production decisions at the factory. But this cost has been imposed on you. You've got unclean air and maybe it's smelly. And you're not compensated for this cost. You're the innocent bystander and that cost has now been imposed on you. Now, here's the thing. The price for this good that's produced by the factory, well, they're not increasing the price to account for this cost. They're not saying at the factory, hey, you know what we're producing creates this smell. We should really ramp up the price so we can compensate people for the smell. They're not doing that, right? And the market, from the market's perspective, and remember the market is just supply and demand coming together to interact. It's not people, but the market acts as if this cost does not exist. So be clear, the market does not internalize this cost, and that is the part you really need to get. That while there is this cost of pollution, the factory's not thinking about that cost, and the market doesn't know what to do with that cost. So think about it. The market acts as if the cost doesn't exist because the firms making the decisions, well, they make their decisions based on the real costs to them. Now, if you're the decision maker at the factory, is the pollution that spills over to other people in the community, is that a real cost to them? No. We're talking about costs that they care about, labor, electricity, rent. Those are real costs to them that they factor in when they're calculating their price, right? But not pollution. So understand why the market doesn't respond to the pollution. That's because decision makers aren't responding to the pollution. Now, I need to point out at this point that we are assuming we're not regulating for pollution at this point. We're just saying that, hey, factories generate pollution, but they don't think of it as a real cost of production, so they don't factor it in. It doesn't get reflected in their price, and because it's not reflected in their price, the market doesn't perceive it as a real cost either. So pollution is a real cost. It's a social cost, but it goes unrecognized by decision makers in the factory and, of course, also the market. So that's what we mean by an external cost. In this case, this is an example that comes from production, right? So this would be in the process of production, we have a negative externality being generated that spills over to people in the community. Are there other negative externalities out there? Of course there are. Automobile exhaust is a good example. So think about distribution. We have all these goods and we have big trucks that deliver them to places like Walmart. And in the process, there's automobile exhaust. That is a negative externality that changes air quality, that affects other people, not necessarily the people that are driving. I guess it affects all of us, but you understand I could be affected even if I never drive a day in my life. Cigarette smoking. If we have cigarette smokers, they are creating an externality, a negative externality for other people nearby. But you can imagine barking dogs, people that have loud pets, they're creating negative externalities for other. And maybe you live in an apartment building somewhere in Farmville? Well, loud stereos in an apartment building is an externality, right? So some externalities are bigger than others, but you get the idea. These are all negative externalities. All right, let's move on to talk about positive externalities. And the example that I'm going to use is immunizations. All right, so immunizations. Let's say a company creates an immunization for mono, and it's highly contagious, right? You probably have known friends that have gotten mono in high school or college. But here's the deal. When you get immunized, you're basically paying to protect yourself, right? So if you got the COVID vaccine, for example, you were paying, because we didn't have to pay at that point, it was all free, but you were making the decision based on the need to protect yourself. But is there a spillover benefit here? Is there an external benefit or positive externality? There is. There's a benefit that spills over to the others around you. And those of you living in high density housing, so like a dorm, well, this is really important. When others get immunized, it protects you. When you get immunized, it protects others, but they might not have been your motive. You may have simply been thinking about yourself, and nothing wrong with that. So the question we need to ask is, are you willing to pay more because of this spillover benefit? Well, not necessarily, right? Most of the time, our demand decisions are made on the basis of our own individual private benefits. And are the other people around you who benefit when you get immunized, are they charged for this benefit? No, they're not. Thus, again, it is an externality. It's a benefit that spills over to others that had nothing to do with your decision to get immunized, but nevertheless they benefit, but they don't have to pay for this benefit. Are there other positive externalities? Of course there are. Two very simple examples: planting trees. If we are to plant a whole bunch of trees, we end up with cleaner air. You might not have had any part of planting the trees. You may not have volunteered to plant the trees. You may not have helped pay for the trees, but yet there's a benefit that's going to spill over to you in the form of cleaner air. And so we often talk about things like the Amazon rainforest as having spillover benefits. And we want to protect the Amazon rainforest because if we lose it, air quality is going to change. So you guys get a very big environmental external benefit from the Amazon jungle. Environmental cleanup. If we have environmental cleanup and our environment gets cleaner, there are positive externalities. And even if you didn't contribute to the cleanup at all, right, it is a benefit that spills over to you. So those are just two examples, a little bit similar. So add immunizations. We have three examples right here of positive externalities. All right. Let's move on to some graphical presentations because this will help this make sense. We're going to start with negative externality, then we'll move on to positive externality. So let's go back to the factory with pollution as our example for negative externality. Now remember, because we know we have a negative externality, this means the market is not efficient, which means the market does not produce the right amount and it does not set the right price. But guys, please be clear. When we say we have market failure because the market is not efficient, that's what we mean. Market failure is when the market is not efficient. So you might want to throw that little note in your notes. When I say the market is not efficient because we have an externality, we have market failure. But it does not mean the market is broken in that it can't function. The market could be functioning perfectly fine. It doesn't mean we have a surplus or a shortage. It just means the equilibrium's not exactly where we want it to be. So that's what I'm going to illustrate to you. All right. So we've got our factory with some kind of externality. In this example, we've got production of aluminum, something that would happen in a factory and something that could create a lot of emissions. So notice you've got your downward sloping demand curve, but notice what I've got in parentheses, private value. When we think about demanders, that's our willingness to pay. That is our private value. It's not the value that spills over to others. So demand captures private value or private marginal benefits. And our supply curve, our upward sloping supply curve, notice in parentheses, it also says private costs. All right. So same kind of situation. The supply curve is capturing marginal cost of production. So let's focus on the supply curve for just a moment. That supply curve, as we just said, reflects marginal cost. So remember, we're talking about marginal cost of production. That upward sloping supply curve is our marginal cost of production for this industry. Keep in mind, these are the costs that they need to cover to break even, right? This is their willingness, their minimum willingness to accept. If you cover marginal costs, then anything you get in terms of price above marginal cost is going to be gravy, right? It's going to be profits. But notice these are private costs. And so what do I mean by that? By private costs, these capture the real costs to the firm, the things that they make decisions over. Labor, electricity, raw materials, those are all their private costs of production, their real costs of production. But notice what it doesn't capture. It's not going to capture pollution, right? Think about it. Is pollution a cost that's similar to labor and electricity and raw materials in the eyes of this company? No. Pollution is a spillover cost to others, but it doesn't really cost the firm anything because we're not regulating the firm at this point. We're going to regulate later as a way of solving this problem. So hopefully it makes sense that a decision maker for the producer in this aluminum factory isn't going to think of pollution as a real cost, but it is going to think about labor and electricity and raw materials as a real cost. So now let's add in the cost of pollution. Now, before you tune out here, this is important. You need to understand that the market is not doing this. This is me, Dr. Marks, doing this for illustration. Okay? So see that red line, that green arrow that says, look, if we want to incorporate all of the costs, let's add in the pollution. We shift up our supply curve by the amount of the green arrow. And now we have basically a new supply curve. It says social cost, but it's just still a supply curve. But this supply curve captures the private costs, but now also those societal costs with the pollution. So think about this as marginal cost is increasing. But I'm going to say it one more time. The market is not doing this. The market does not know how to capture the social cost. This is me, Dr. Marks, doing this purely for illustration purposes. All right. So now we have two different outcomes. Notice one says equilibrium. That's the market equilibrium. And the other says the optimum, optimal, best, socially beneficial point. So basically what we're saying is, look, the equilibrium where the blue lines intersect, that's where the market operates. That's where the demand and the private cost supply curve intersect. But we know that doesn't really capture all of the costs because there are societal costs, that pollution. So we said, look, if we really cared about trying to internalize the societal costs, then that supply curve should shift up vertically by the amount of the cost of pollution. And we get that new red social cost curve. And we really want to be at the other outcome where it says the optimum. And by optimum, we say this is the best, the socially best point. So this is where we want to operate. So we have two outcomes. One is where we want to operate, and the other is where the market is going to operate. Now, again, remember, why are they not the same? Because we have an externality, a cost of pollution. And the factory, the decision makers in the factory don't think about pollution as a real cost. It's a spillover cost to innocent bystanders, but it's not a cost that costs anyone money when we're not regulating yet in this factory. All right, so everybody with me? So we have two different results, but where's the market going to operate? Where the two blue lines intersect. The market does not know how to get to the other outcome that says optimum. Markets can't do that. So keep that in mind. Markets cannot move us there. But let's continue to compare. We see that the output is different. So notice that the optimal output, I'm going to call that Q star, is less than the market output. So what does this tell us? The market is producing too much, right? The market is producing too much in this case because we have a negative externality. So when we have a negative externality that the market can't take into account, like pollution, it will overproduce. So that's our first result. The market overproduces, right? And then if you look at the price axis, we see the equilibrium price, and I'm sorry, I don't have labels on those prices, but you see what I'm doing there. The equilibrium price is not the same as the optimal price. So P star, our optimal price, where society would prefer the price to be, given that we account for pollution, is greater than the market price. Okay, so let's think about what just happened. The market is working, right? So look, supply equals demand. The market is working. We're at equilibrium. There's no shortage. There's no surplus. So we don't want to say the market is broken. That is not what we mean. The market is fully functioning. It's just ignoring certain costs. And because it's ignoring certain costs, it produces too much, which it means we don't have the optimal allocation of resources, and it underprices. Basically, if you're consuming something that in the production process requires a huge amount of pollution, you should pay for that, right? But that price does not go up as a function of the pollution, right? We're not saying, hey, let's raise the price because you have pollution. The market does not know how to do that. So we're back to this idea of market failure. And by market failure, we're saying, hey, look, the market functions. Be clear. It's not broken. It's still functioning, right? Supply equals demand. We're at an equilibrium. We just saw that. But where it's operating is not efficient. It's not the socially optimal. So be clear, efficient and socially optimal, two of the same things, just two terms for the same concept. So I'm going to say that again because a lot of people try to tell me market failure means the market is broken. The market's not broken. It's working. It's just not incorporating all of the costs. So therefore, it's not efficient. It's not socially optimal. And that means the market produces too much. It's not producing the right amount. We really want less of something that has a negative externality, right? If something causes pollution, we want less of it. And the market price is too low. If something has a lot of pollution associated with it, we want less of it and we want it to have a higher price. So why is this happening? Why do we have market failure? Because the decision makers do not internalize pollution as a real cost, right? They internalize labor because they got to give them a paycheck. They internalize raw materials because they got to buy them from somewhere. But they don't internalize pollution as a real cost. They care about the direct private costs. They don't think about the spillover cost to society. So how do we force firms to internalize this type of external cost? Well, there are things that we can do. One, we can have fines or taxes for pollution. So if we are going to charge firms for pollution, well, that will change their incentive structure. When we tax something, we end up with less of it, right? So if we want less of this good, taxing it is an option. But we also have environmental regulation. When we have environmental regulation, now you're forced to think about the spillover costs. Without environmental regulation, you don't think about pollution as a cost in any way. But if you're forced to meet EPA mandates, if there are restrictions on how much you're allowed to pollute and those kinds of things, if you're required to have certain technologies, now we can force firms to internalize this cost. But are they going to think about the externality on their own? No, they are not, because it's a social cost and not a private cost. So folks, this is how government addresses market failure. Markets cannot address externalities. Governments have to address externalities. So government plays a big role. In this case, government action is good. You're not always going to have economists say government action is good because we like markets, right? But this is one case where economists are going to agree government has to have a role. Markets can't solve this market failure problem. It doesn't know how to internalize externalities. Government has to do something like tax or have environmental regulation. Let's move on to a graphical presentation related to a positive externality. And because I've given you fewer examples of positive externalities, we're going to use education. And most economists agree that education creates external benefits. When we educate people, when we educate youth, it benefits others, right? It benefits those youths as well, but it also creates benefits to others. There are spillover benefits to everyone else in society. For example, when we educate our youth, we end up with lower poverty rates, and that's great. We have lower crime rates. We have more engagement in the community. These are all things that are spillover benefits that come from education. So imagine a world where everyone pays for their own K-12 education. And I realize you didn't grow up that way, so that is hard to think about. But we want to talk about before we solve the market failure problem. So before, if we're thinking about before and after, the before is everyone has to pay for K-12 education. And then I can look at a graph of a market. All right. So education creates spillover benefits to others, but we're in a world where we pay for our schooling. All right. So here is our graph. We've got demand for education, downward sloping, right? And we've got the supply of education. Both of these are private though, right? The supply is the private cost of education, and the demand is private value or private benefits or willingness to pay. So because this is a positive externality, now we need to focus on the demand side. So we want to understand that our demand curve reflects private benefits, right? Private willingness to pay. And what we mean by that is that consumers of education don't incorporate the benefit to others in their decision process, right? Does anyone say, oh, I'm willing to pay more because there are spillover benefits to others? No one says that, right? They think about what is it going to do for me, my kid? That's how I get my private value. But there are spillover benefits to others. So here's the thing, that demand curve that we're looking at underestimates the total value of education, right? There's a social value of education and there's a private value of education. So the private value of education is what demanders are going to make their decisions on. So again, demanders don't say, hey, I'll pay more because there are spillover benefits to others, and I know the social value is a lot greater. That's not how demanders work when they're trying to pay for private education, right? So we have to look at the demand curve and do the same kind of thing we did before. So now let's ask ourselves, what would happen if we added in the benefits that spill over to others? So see what I've done. I've said, hey, look, we've got private benefits to those people that are getting the education, but then I have all those other benefits, the reduction in crime, more engagement. You get the idea. So the green line, let's say, theoretically measures how much that value increases by. Now, again, be very clear. Can the market do this? No, the market cannot think about spillover benefits to others in terms of reduced crime when we're talking about education. It's going to operate along the blue supply curve and the blue demand curve. So again, this is me, Dr. Marks, saying, hey, what if we could measure these benefits? And what if we then add them to the graph? So it's a what if. So we're back to the same kind of situation we had before. We have a point where the market operates, and that's going to be along the blue supply curve and blue demand curve, right, where they intersect. And you see it says QM for Q market. But then we have where we want to operate. And we want to operate where our social demand curve, it says social value, but it's really, I would probably call it a social demand curve if I didn't steal this graph from somebody else. So where we want to operate is at a slightly different point. So here's the problem. Again, we have market failure. The market does one thing, but what is socially optimal because of the spillover benefits, because of those external benefits to others, well, that brings us to a completely different place. So again, we can look at quantity, and we see that the market quantity is less than the optimal quantity. right? That the market is producing less education than is optimal. But again, the market can't internalize externalities. Now, we're going to ignore kind of the pricing function here. It is true that the optimal price would be higher, and so people should have to pay more for education because of the spillover benefits. But we generally don't focus on that as much as we do when we have an external cost. All right, so let's ask ourselves the same question. How do we solve this market failure? And again, by market failure, we're saying where we want to be and where the market brings us are not the same thing. Well, in this case, do you agree we want more education? When we came to aluminum, because that had an external cost, we wanted less, but we want more. So how do we get more of something? Well, we subsidize. So subsidize means we put money towards it. You've probably heard of subsidies for like alternative fuel cars. There's a subsidy for hybrid cars, for example. These are what we mean by subsidies. It's the opposite of tax. So if you understand a tax, the opposite is a subsidy. So we're going to subsidize. When we subsidize, we're going to put money towards education. And if we subsidize it, it lowers the price of education. Well, think about what we do in our country. We literally subsidize it up to it being free, right? It's subsidized to a degree where you don't have to pay anything, but that's still a subsidy. And by the way, in some countries, that's not true. Parts of Africa, people do not get free education. So we are choosing to subsidize education, and same is true of other developed countries, obviously. We subsidize it up to it being free. But in addition, we have some regulation. We have laws that require attendance until you're 16 because, look, we understand it's important for you to get educated, but it's also important to society when you get educated. So again, we see the same kind of outcome, but I want you to be clear. In one case, the market produced too much, right? In the other case, the market produced too little. So do understand that what is happening with market failure, the nature of the market failure, depends on if you have an external cost or you have an external benefit. So let's wrap this up. Earlier in the semester, we've said that markets are efficient, and they usually are. So I wasn't lying to you when I said markets are efficient. They usually are, but there are cases when it's not true. When an externality is present, markets will not be efficient. Now, externalities is not the only example. We've probably also talked about when we're trying to provide public goods. But when an externality is present, markets are not going to be efficient. Understand that the market still works, but it's not operating at the socially optimal level. It's not at the optimal place. Think about why this type of market failure is happening. Remember, we said firms in their supply decisions, they think about their private costs and they ignore things like spillover costs. But the same thing is true about consumers. Consumers think about private benefits. We don't think about the spillover benefits, right? So what ends up happening is that those spillover costs and those spillover benefits are just not relevant in decisions. So supply decisions aren't impacted, demand decisions aren't impacted, and therefore the market does not capture this, right? Because a market is nothing other than supply and demand. We agree that government has a big role in addressing market failure, right? The market can't solve this problem. That's why we call it market failure. So we need to use things like taxes, subsidies, regulation, but you've got to make sure you remember when would you tax and when would you subsidize. Remember, taxes are when we want less of something and subsidies are when we want more of something. So like for immunizations, again, to leave you with that example, as Longwood students, you were required to have immunizations. Well, why would you be required to have immunizations? Well, the reason is that there's a big spillover cost. There is a possibility of large negative externalities for all of those other people that you live with, for example, in a dorm. So we're done with our introduction to externalities. Hopefully it all makes sense, but let me know if you have any questions at all. And thank you for listening. Have a great day.